I like to go to other fields and say, okay, do they have like a missing Hubble Space Telescope? Because astronomy was particularly able to address this issue. We don't have a perfect theory of like how science happens, right? For one that we could perfectly apply in practice. And so there's an element where I don't want to like replace the existing institutions. I want them to like still do their like that complex ecosystem with like a rainforest. You know, I don't want to cut down the rainforest and replace it with a parking lot. The execution path would need to look like a deep tech startup or kind of that level of systems engineering to execute. And then the funding path sort of looks like a market failure for some reason.
Body. What is it?
Fleming of St Mary's Hospital, London, who discovered that it produces the drug known as penicillin.
The question was, which drug would go with which cell?
It's a collaboration that's unexpected because it's between humans and the tiniest organisms.
The howl of a dire wolf.
Dorset lamb may represent a major landmark.
I did not start off planning to design proteins.
Scientific breakthrough will probably be something that we hard to imagine.
Test at birth could map out an individual's entire future risk of disease.
I mean, you and, I don't know how to pronounce his name, is it Alexei or Alexei? I kind of put you in the same category of being somewhat disenchanted by the existing mechanisms of funding and the existing institutions in which research and development is done, and sort of identifying the fact that a lot of people and a lot of research projects slip through the gaps, right? And I think that's kind of the main premise of Convergent, which is this kind of non-profit institute that you've started that I don't exactly know how it's structured, and I think we can talk a little bit about that, but sort of I want a bit of the backstory around how it came to be and what was the sort of driving impetus to start it.
Yeah. So maybe I'll start for my journey in grad school. And I think it's not really that I'm disenchanted with anything. It's really just relative to the specific goals, right? I see a lot of gaps that need to be filled or things that the existing system isn't sort of designed or set up to like systematically solve for, while at the same time being very enchanted with even like kind of inscrutable aspects. Like I think I don't advocate for like replacing the research system with some new system that like a few people know how to design better or something like that. That when you have these large systems of like, you know, tens of thousands of scientists working across academia and industry and like in this very fluid, you know, complex way, yeah, there are definitely some systemic problems with it, but there's also aspects of why it's working that I don't think we necessarily know exactly why it doesn't work. We don't have a perfect theory of like how science happens, right? Or one that we can perfectly apply in practice. And so there's an element where like I don't want to like replace the existing institutions. I want them to like still do their like that complex ecosystem. It's like a rainforest, you know. I don't want to cut down the rainforest and replace it with a parking lot. I think there are aspects of that rainforest of kind of the existing scientific ecosystem that they're generating a lot, and we don't even exactly know exactly why and how and what could break there if we tried to change it. But I am interested in filling gaps or trying to solve for pieces that I think it's not solving as well. And I guess the way I tend to explain maybe the easiest example of that gap that I think is kind of most palpable, I think about the example of the Hubble Space Telescope. So the Hubble Space Telescope, so as a kind of category of project or thing, the Hubble Space Telescope is not an academic project, nor is it an industrial project. It is a piece of scientific infrastructure where once the Hubble Space Telescope was built, like every academic astronomer, they could do more, right? We had just better resolution imaging of the universe. But but it wasn't like an astronomical discovery. It wasn't like I'm a grad student and my thesis was the Hubble Space Telescope. It wasn't like my lab discovered the Hubble Space Telescope. It also is an industrial project. It's not something that people made money off of making the Hubble Space Telescope. It's really a feat of engineering, of coordination, of basically saying, what is the infrastructure? What is the thing that needs to be built by a team of people to accelerate the rate of science in some area? In that case, astronomy. And so then I like to go to other fields and say, okay, do they have like a missing Hubble Space Telescope? Because astronomy was particularly able to address this issue. Astronomy is like the oldest science, right? You know, going back to, you know, Mesopotamia and whatever, looking at the stars. Very mature in some ways, very clear what it needs. You need a big mirror in space. The bigger, the better. The smoother, the better. The more pixels on the camera, the better, etc. So it's very clear, and in a way that is part of the kind of military-industrial complex as well. Like a lot of the big science projects that have happened, even the Human Genome Project was partly happened through the Department of Energy, right? Department of Energy is like, that's basically what came out of, like, think about the Manhattan Project, nuclear, aerospace, right? So in the sort of aerospace, military, industrial, nuclear energy, you know, kind of complex, we can build particle accelerators and we can build Hubble Space Telescopes. And sometimes we build a Human Genome Project, even, you know, partly initiated through DOE, my understanding. Now go to some other field, go to neuroscience, go to ecology, go to the study of, you know, social systems and democracy, etc. Math, even theoretical fields. Is it possible that they're just missing their Hubble Space Telescope equivalent and the institutional impetus and funding impetus that would have made that? And, you know, in terms of me individually, like, I think just personality wise, as a grad student doing my own experiments and trying to kind of nucleate collaborations, and for better or for worse, it's actually, I think there's actually a positive thing about academia. The version of academia that I was in was very much like, go ahead, Adam, think about what the Hubble Space Telescope for neuroscience might be. Awesome. Now, that's not really necessarily a great career path to like just think about what the Hubble Space Telescope might be. It doesn't lead to a lot of incremental, you know, papers that you can publish on neuroscience, because you don't actually have the resources to go and build it, or the team to go and build it. And so broadly, my intellectual interest just always looked Hubble Space Telescope shaped, mega project, more like shaped, thinking about the technological infrastructure that shapes what the researchers can do, and less like individual projects shaped. And some people just have their talents much more honed to like incredible individual project development. Mine was more like always looking for the Hubble Space Telescope. And so what we're doing now essentially is like just systematizing that with an organization. But that's where my personality always gravitated towards. But academia is diverse enough that it can sometimes allow people to do their PhD in part thinking about what are the missing Hubble Space Telescopes of neuroscience or nanotechnology or so on. And as a student in the Church Lab, I was able to do some mixture of that. And
yeah, that's fascinating. I suppose then, what are the Hubble Space Telescopes of these fields? What is missing, and what do we need?
Well, that's actually partly the interesting question, because it is not a question that people typically get asked, right? People typically ask, you know, if you're a professor, you're basically asked to write a grant about what can my lab do, right? Mm-hmm. If you're a PhD student, you're asked to propose a thesis that you can actually do. You're not really asked what is that missing tool, data set, resource system that would sort of lift all the boats in your field, even if it required like this more organized or industry-like engineering team to go and build that, because you don't have that team. And so because people are basically not routinely asked that question, Michael Nielsen called this a form of intellectual dark matter. So intellectual dark matter is like ideas that like could be surfaced. They're like close, like they're ideas people could have, but they just never get surfaced, right? Like probably like most of the best ideas for like CRISPR enzymes with less off-target effects or something like that. I don't think there's like scientific limitations there. Like we may not have been smart enough to like figure out what those are, but there's not like if someone finds out or someone works on that, like that will like get surfaced, right? But if someone is like thinking, on their walk or whatever around the neighborhood, my field needs X and such Hubble Space Telescope infrastructure, or what if you could do this? There isn't really like a systematic process for eliciting those ideas. And so part of what we're doing is we're just asking a different question. We're going to the research community and saying, what is the missing Hubble Space Telescope in your field? Or equivalent to that. Oftentimes, to be clear, these are much smaller than the actual Hubble Space Telescope, which is like I don't know how much it costs, but probably multi-billion-dollar type of project. We think that this like dark matter of sort of missing projects also applies at the scale of 20 or 30 person teams, not necessarily huge billion-dollar projects. So we've been going around and asking the research community kind of, what are your missing Hubble Space Telescopes? And who wants to lead the teams that would build those? And we found some interesting, surprising answers. So some of them are ones where we kind of went in expecting it. So for neuroscience, which is one of the areas that kind of motivated me to sort of be interested in this, I had a pretty strong feeling that neuroscience was missing several Hubbles, even despite incredible efforts by folks like the Allen Institute. They sort of build up some major infrastructure in neuroscience that it was still missing kind of next gen technologies for kind of Hubble Space Telescopes of neuroscience. So in neuroscience, like we have one project on brain circuit mapping, that's E11 Bio. We have one on human brain interfacing. So a lot of people kind of stick electrodes in mouse brains, but a human is harder because it's a human. There's a huge amount of ethical kind of issue there and safety issue. And so the state of the art methods of recording the brain are kind of hard to apply in humans. But we have one that's using ultrasound on a chip technology that's called Forest Neurotech, which is an implantable chip that goes underneath the skull but above the brain, that shines ultrasound into the brain. So we think that is kind of like it's a whole brain neural interface using ultrasound. So we think that's kind of like a Hubble observational platform for human neuroscience, human kind of whole brain neuroscience.
And manipulation as well.
And manipulation, yep. And that's kind of the beginning of a larger platform that can potentially be based on ultrasound. So in neuroscience, we were like, I kind of just intuitively knew in neuroscience there would be several of these things, and there's more yet. We need like a connectome, but like dynamic, changing. There's like the development of the brain. There's different things that you want kind of like to like digitize like a small nervous system, kind of have a kind of input output model of all the neurons in something like C. elegans, tiny 302 neuron worm. So neuroscience is like a huge fount of these. But then the question is like, where else are these things missing? And we've got some surprising answers. I mean, one of the ones that I think is more surprising is software for math, right? I think of math as just being this thing where it's all about mathematicians on the whiteboard. Is really just limited by like human cognition. There isn't like an infrastructure, right? Like astronomers, like obviously they don't know the shape of that galaxy until they take the picture, right? Yeah. But mathematicians, it's all just about human intellect and like, doing stuff on the whiteboard and training your students and stuff. And it turns out that there is an infrastructure that was needing a lot more resourcing, and that infrastructure is the software for verifying and expressing mathematical proofs in a code or programming language. So there's this programming language called Lean, which prior to the focused research organization that we've been supporting had basically like a small open source community, but in terms of full-time people, it really just had like a couple of students and like a couple of people then at Microsoft. And so Lean is this programming language where instead of writing your mathematical proof on like pencil and paper, essentially in English plus math notation, you convert all that into a formal language and you write it in Lean. And then, but the cool thing about Lean is that you can basically hit a button at the end and it will say, is your proof correct? In other words, do the conclusions follow from the assumptions with a complete chain of like valid logical steps? So it can like verify the math proof. And turns out that's like a pretty powerful primitive to have. So if you have a math proof that is so complicated that only a few people can understand it, how can someone actually build on that? Well, one way you can do it is someone who may be more novice in that field can add some kind of rungs onto that proof and then automatically verify whether it's still true, right? So it can enable more collaboration and it can enable wider participation and more minds on a single math proof because they can have this validation button and this common representation in code. It's also super powerful for AI because you might have an LLM, let's say, and an LLM is basically in some ways very smart and in some ways completely dumb, and it can hallucinate all sorts of nonsense. And but if it can hallucinate something and then validate, okay, well, actually, this is the subset of the stuff that I hallucinated that's actually mathematically correct. Now, all of a sudden, the LLM actually can extend math. And then you can use that as a reward signal so it gets better at producing stuff that passes the checker. So that's an example where I think we didn't know when thinking about this and sort of being inspired by ideas like the Hubble Space Telescope or big projects in neuroscience, that their math would be one that has its own like missing Hubble Space Telescope that needs a kind of industry-like but nonprofit team to build that shared infrastructure for math. And we are continuing to kind of propagate this out and say, okay, well, what about other fields, right? What about climate, ecology, social science? So we're sort of building this graph of it, and we've started to embody some of our findings in this database that we call the gap map. So I don't know if you've seen this yet, but we have something called gap-map.org. And it is basically a kind of summary of our conversations with researchers by saying, okay, what are the sort of missing fundamental capabilities? And how do they contribute to solving sort of gaps or bottlenecks, technological bottlenecks in research, like inability to see the actual structure of the brain, or something like might be like a broad gap in neuroscience. You can't see the circuitry, and then like a fundamental capability might be like cheap brain circuit mapping or something like that. And so we've been making a map that has maybe like 100 or so gaps right now, and like a couple hundred fundamental capabilities. Where those are not necessarily all equally important, and that's not necessarily comprehensive, but it illustrates this category. If you ask, well, how many missing Hubble Space Telescopes are there? I think a couple hundred. Yeah.
Interesting. Let's take a step back around the sort of structure of academia currently. So you have these university sort of centers of excellence, of scientific discovery. They're usually backed by philanthropic donors or endowments or sort of government funding, which is kind of retreating, which we can get into a little bit later. And then you have, and these tend to be quite good at sort of incremental tech dev, incremental innovation, usually driven by small groups or even individual grad students and sort of postdocs with some assistance. And then they also tend to be good at sort of curiosity-driven discovery of things that only niche people pay attention to, right? And then you have obviously the sort of startup world and the venture capital world that sort of takes the interesting and sort of presumably useful parts of this academic innovation and funds it so that we can commercialize it. And what you're saying is that there's a whole gap of really important projects, particularly in tool development, that sort of allow other scientists to unlock their capabilities and sort of what questions they want to ask and are capable of answering through experimentation, and to get like a large group of sort of 10 to 30 people, with $25-30 million of funding in this sort of time-limited, well-defined set of sort of technical milestones, and sort of put them together and tell them to run with the idea, right? So is that a good summary of?
That's a great summary. Yeah. Yeah, it's really like a very precise kind of slicing that you have to get to. It's like, it's not that academia can't do tool development. In fact, it sometimes does absolutely incredible tool development, right?
Yeah.
It's not that industry can't do really far-ranging technology. Sometimes it does really far-ranging technology, but it's like, where are these combination of something where you sort of, the execution path would need to look like a deep tech startup or kind of that level of systems engineering to execute, and then the funding path sort of looks like a market failure for some reason. Like,
what do you mean by that?
Like, you can't get like the way that sort of deep tech startups essentially work is like, sometimes you do get $20 or $50 million or something, or even more. Some of these fusion energy companies, for example, have like billions of dollars effectively of venture capital. Obviously, AI companies now have billions of dollars of venture capital to do quite deep technological development. So sometimes you can finance that. But the Hubble Space Telescope, again, is an example where it's like, you kind of need something that's like, I don't know, building the Hubble Space Telescope versus training GPT-5 or something like that. Those are probably, somewhat comparable in terms of like difficulty, or number of people, et cetera, to do it. Amount of coordination and engineering and everything that's needed, beyond just individual creative people kind of floating around. One of those, originally, OpenAI was a nonprofit, and they thought that they would have to essentially treat this in this nonprofit way, because the path to AGI would be so long. For example, or it's not even clear what the intermediate products are on the way. Now you can finance GPT-5 with billions of dollars of private money, but the Hubble Space Telescope needs a similar type of work in some ways, but then the market is astronomers, right? And astronomers don't have money to pay for that. They just want to understand the universe.
One in the sort of optimistic case is potentially revenue generating and superintelligence unlocking. The other one is never ordained to be.
And it's not that astronomy is less. I mean, AGI is a special example, but it's we could think about other examples where there's even kind of subtle boundaries. Illumina that makes this DNA sequencing machines, multi-billion-dollar company. So they've been able to find a commercial path after a certain point, at least, to develop a really robust sequencing technology for DNA.
Welcome to the Frameshifts podcast, where we spotlight the world's most ambitious biotech founders, investors, researchers, and changemakers. This episode is brought to you from the offices of Polsinelli, a national law firm that helps biotech companies do everything from incorporation to patents, trademarks, and venture financings. Thanks to Polsinelli for being part of the growing ecosystem of scientists, investors, and builders shaping the century of biology. So let's talk about this gray area then, right? Because there's a lot of tool development that obviously happens in academia. There's this great cluster within the Broad Institute and Harvard and MIT, where you have, for example, Ed Boyden working on expansion microscopy and sort of various other tools of being able to manipulate and perceive molecules and perceive the genome, especially sort of spatial sequencing technologies. What is it about sort of, for example, connectome mapping that could not have been achieved in a similar sort of Ed Boyden Broad Institute collection of academic labs pursuing a similar goal.
Yeah, it's always hard to really say couldn't. It's like, and also a lot of the key steps towards the ways that we've been trying to pursue that were in fact literally developed by those people, and we were involved in some of that. So yeah, I would describe the expansion microscopy work as essentially a kind of discovery of a new technology, right? 2 or 3 people really driving, can you actually use these expanding hydrogels to uniformly? The big question was, yes, we know that gels expand, but does it kind of tear the tissue, right? Is it uniform? And it's uniform down to the nanoscale. So you needed a really cross-disciplinary lab, right? They had to be able to do super resolution microscopy of the existing types to be able to validate the expansion microscopy was true down to the nanoscale. So a cross-disciplinary lab, and it would have been very hard to say, well, the goal of the lab is to develop expansion microscopy. We therefore need 1 hydrogel chemist and 1 super resolution microscopist and 1 engineer and 1 DNA conjugation person to make the initial tags and probes that they used because they digested it with proteases to get rid of the proteins, but they had DNA that was left over as the tags that could be expanded apart. So there's all sorts of clever stuff that was happening in Ed's lab and those labs, which it was really not possible to predict in advance. Or like form like a fixed engineering team, the way a startup forms like a fixed engineering team. It happened that in the fertile, intellectual, ever-shifting environment of lots of MIT grad students and postdocs and professors interacting with each other, they came up with this like serendipitous combination of DNA tags and digesting with proteases and using the hydrogel and validating it with microscopes that they could get access to. So like the basic idea that now our FRO, E11 Bio, which is still collaborating with MIT, is basing it on is this like serendipitous discovery of expansion microscopy. And it wasn't totally serendipitous because like Ed was channeling it, like, could we have a scalable super resolution method? What if you could expand the hydrogel? But that was one of many ideas. You don't know exactly what's going to pan out. So in that case, like, yeah, the academic environment was like crucial for that tool. Okay. Beyond that initial discovery, what is actually needed to reify this into like a scalable connectomic mapping technology? Then you start to get to work that looks more like industrial style work. Like you really have to optimize the labeling, you have to optimize the resolution, you have to if you make slices, can you stitch together the slices? Can you computationally analyze it? Can you actually pick out the connections? It's just like the style of the work becomes both more clear what you want to do, more clear how you could accomplish that by dividing up the labor, less based on serendipity, more based on coordination. And as you move into that regime, it makes more sense to hire professional roles for each of those pieces and coordinate them to focus on that goal rather than a more open-ended set of goals where you have like this more unpredictable discovery. But the unpredictable discovery was like in many ways the key to this even being possible, right? So you really need both.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you need industrial scaling of a academic, of something that becomes enabled through academic innovation, but sort of is not financially viable and sort of capable of generating immediate revenue, you spin out an FRO instead.
That would and if it's really important, solving a really important bottleneck, and you can really motivate, people are really motivated to actually solve this problem and come together as a team, but they don't have a way to come together as a team and each get their own tenure packages and each get their own publications and each get their own PhD theses by doing it. They need to actually be employed by an organization that just pays them to allow them to actually work together on this thing. If the thing is really important, then that's your sweet spot for an FRO. Yeah.
Are there alternative org structures? Like one of the challenges that's frequently cited with any sort of nonprofit organization is that sort of the incentives of the employees are no longer aligned with the success of the company per se. You have to have these extremely mission-driven individuals that are willing to put aside their sort of immediate financial prosperity in exchange for the sort of gleeful expansion of science. Is there a way of doing this as a for-profit company, but sort of differently structured, similar to the way, for example, that sort of OpenAI had this like, that's such a unique structure, but sort of is there alternatives?
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I would also say that there's a category of company where it's just non-traditional investors and where there's an openness to the possibility that often these individual investors are like high net worth individuals, right? Sometimes corporate research labs do it. Think about Google X, right? So it's not that it has to like absolutely has to be done in a nonprofit structure, and there is a kind of a long-term alignment, right? If you have a well-defined like product or market that you're trying to serve and a kind of North Star that ultimately aligns just in the very long term, maybe with building a extremely valuable product. So I would say the fusion energy companies are kind of in this example. Like they're doing the kind of work that otherwise is going on in national labs that are doing fusion research, right? All of that, the goal in some sense has always been to like make practical fusion energy, right? There's some additional science that they do for other reasons and stuff, but what we've seen is somewhat of a shift from national lab facilities that build the kind of prototype fusion power generators, reactors, to that being done by just very long range companies. And to my mind, that kind of just makes sense. Like it's a very long-term proposition, but like if you manage to eventually put fusion reactors on the grid, like that can generate a lot of revenue, right? That's very valuable. And that's ultimately a product or service. So that's one dimension, is like, is it just long-term or is it more like a public good? If it's really an open source data set, that's the fundamental thing you need to do, or a sort of shared capability where the user base is fundamentally just scientists, right? Like the Hubble Space Telescope is this kind of extreme example. I don't know if it ever would have made sense to do the Hubble Space Telescope as a for-profit. I think you would have had to convolute that in some complicated way. Oh, we're actually going to make spy satellites, but maybe we'll also do the Hubble Space Telescope. It kind of would be a distraction. There's another dimension to it of, closed versus open, and when do organizations that are for profit, aligned in that way, feel like they can publish, right? Do the backers accept that to get the ultimate progress that you need to publish and exchange? Is not I forget whose quote it is. There are always going to be more smart people outside your company than inside. And if that's the case, then you kind of like should be publishing so you can, and so that they can then publish on top of your thing, and you benefit from that work as well. And so like I think that with modern AI, like transformers are an example of that, right? Where OpenAI, like GPT, is the T in that is transformer. Transformers were actually originally developed at Google. They published that, but then of course now they're also benefiting from that, like that ecosystem. So it's also like, how openly do you publish? So there's like a legal structure. Is there like a ultimately marketable product versus a public good? There's openness. Those are all different dimensions. I think we should play with them more. I mean, depending on who the backers are and what their risk tolerance is, you can have a for-profit entity that's very open. You can have a nonprofit entity that you can kind of mix and match these different combinations. I think one like experimental, ultimately it's like an experimental science. Like human beings are an experimental science. You actually don't know what org structures are going to work, and sometimes it depends on the particular people and the particular problems that they're going after, and the particular kind of point in time and alignment of different stakeholders in that thing. So there's not necessarily like a perfect science of, oh, all FROs have to be nonprofit or for-profit or something. But some of the things that people say, these kind of heuristics that they have, we did hear a lot at the beginning. you're never going to really be able to have like a really well functioning deep tech company like team unless there's equity in a potentially very valuable for profit. That's just what people were used to. And there's an argument like, okay, yeah, well, equity helps align people. It's true. Equity helps align people, but is that the main thing that's contributing to their alignment? Or is it more the mission driven? Or is it more the culture? Or is it more just having something very concrete to work on and having engineers and scientists who like really like love making that technical progress and like kind of compounding nature of it just working, right? And sometimes the arguments people make, well, you always have to have equity. Well, okay, well, I don't know. People didn't have equity in the Apollo project or whatever. It's still
or in academia.
Right? Yeah, people don't have it. So it's not like you, right? And then sometimes you have academic teams that are actually very well aligned. They tend to be smaller. I think it's hard to have like a 30-person academic team that's like incredibly well aligned in that way. There's not enough like operational like roles and like affordances to like help build the structure. It's more self-organizing, but you can have small teams of academics that are like way more aligned than a bunch of people who all have equity in something. And so initially we did get a certain response like, no, the way to do anything even vaguely deep tech startup like is you have to have this startup equity structure and legal structure and compensation structure. And it's like, I just don't think so. I just think that the software development project we have that's making lean for math it's just functioning really well. And like, sorry, it's a nonprofit. I don't know how to explain it, but they don't have equity in lean, right? But they're functioning in a very tight-knit way. And yeah, so.
Interesting. So the distinguishing factor here is that you need to be publishing in order to be in a constant exchange with the research community that's kind of outside of the company. You need to be developing tools that are then open sourced for the scientific community. And I guess like
that tends to be an important variable in thinking about what kind of structure you want to go for is how much do you want to lock it down, or can you actually accomplish your goal while locking it down? I think we shouldn't lock down the connectome, right? I think we're going to need the connectome to be open source for all the different neuroscientists and AI people and everything to like figure out what's going on with the connectome. So trying to say, well, we're going to do it and make it proprietary just doesn't, it ends up defeating the original scientific purpose. There are other cases, like it may be that the IP for the fusion reactor can be locked down and proprietary. You don't need 5 other national labs trying it out and 6 other companies publishing papers on which variants work. You just need one company to get that fusion reactor to work, manufacture it, put it on the grid. They didn't need a scientific exchange back and forth. It's enough to just hire good people in your company to build the fusion reactor. Or maybe fusion's not there. Maybe there's versions of fusion that need a fertile scientific community, open source, to make the progress needed to get to the fusion reactor. It's not clear in that case. But
I see. Yeah. There's some uncertainty to the right structure. I think the other thing is you brought up the attention is all you need paper. And a lot of people make fun of Google. Like, oh, you released this and now you're like no longer at the cutting edge of AI. But if you like look at everyone's stock price, like they've all gone up. Like the fact that this was released and the fact that LLMs are actually like an economically valuable tool benefited not just Google.
It took them some number of months to get to the point where they could get on the scaling curve. Right, they were behind for a second on the scaling. I think they're not behind really anymore. Yeah. It was fine. They open sourced the thing. Scientific revolution. That's great. I'm glad they did. Yeah.
You mentioned that you obviously in the sort of like GAPS project interview a bunch of scientists and sort of ask them about what are the tools that are missing in order to help them ask the questions, answer the questions they want to ask. To what extent do you think that scientists don't know what the right tools are? Like, for example, if you went back in time and sort of asked, genome scientists or sort of genomics professors, what tool would you want? They may have asked for sort of better sequencing or like a faster version of Sanger, but not so much, I wish we had this bacterial immune system that could sort of manipulate the genome and allow me to insert sort of anything I want or delete anything I want. How do you think about this kind of this problem of people not knowing necessarily what is the tool that will unlock gains for them?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. It's also one of the reasons why I think you do need that fertile, serendipitous, quote unquote, academic foment community of smart people. Because the people working on CRISPR didn't actually realize there were some people that wanted programmable gene editors. There were some people that were working on the right CRISPR systems. Some of the people that got the Nobel Prize were the ones that were able to bridge that gap, right? But that took a bunch of different steps. It wasn't a totally designed process. No one started the company that said, I am going to go and discover CRISPR as a programmable gene editor by going and looking at these, yogurt, maybe bacteria, immune systems and everything, right? It was a bottom-up process, not a top-down process. So partly it's just emergent. People don't know until it gets closer, and then they know. There's only so many steps you can do it. That's one picture of it. For some areas so you need that academic foment. There's some other areas where I think you can potentially design it more, but the system isn't incredibly well set up to design it. So, and sometimes the example that we think about here, again, comes back to neuroscience. So there's a lot of tools that the neuroscientists are going to need in order to record all the brain activity, ultimately, neurons turning on and off. Some of those are going to require really advanced microchips of one kind or another. So for the example that I gave earlier of ultrasound in the brain, that's a micro-machined chip, ultrasound on a chip technology. It's a phased array of ultrasound, lots of little tiny cantilevers, basically, electronically controlled, generating ultrasound, vibrating really fast. Neuroscientists are not chip designers, so how could you really expect the neuroscience community to self-generate that tool, right? You could say, well, we need a cross-disciplinary project on the tool development. Okay, but what does that really mean? I mean, the ultrasound on a chip thing is actually more like an industrial thing than even an academic thing. Who is it that actually knows that ultrasound on a chip technology is good enough that it could actually help neuroscience? So part of it is cross-disciplinary training, right? And have, exchange with physics, engineering, neuroscience. And I think that these are things that funding agencies and stuff, at least now, kind of nominally understand that you should fund these cross-disciplinary groups to kind of think about these larger problems. But then actually organizing the team that executes that, for one thing, is really hard. And again, if you don't have a way of organizing the team that executes it or funding the team that executes it, you're not very well incentivized to go and do the work to actually go talk to the industry chip design people to figure out what can or can't be made. It's not necessarily a role that someone can kind of spend full time on, because they might need to pay the bills by generating the next neuroscience paper or the next chip paper, depending on what department they're in. So the way that we sort of try to solve this is road mapping. So we try to support just very explicit efforts of someone to go and take ownership and say, I'm going to organize the workshop that brings together the ultrasound people and the neuroscience people, or I am going to get paid by conversion or get paid by someone else to use my physics skills to actually calculate whether the ultrasound would actually be applicable to the brain in the right ways, even though that's not necessarily a great publication for me in ultrasound land or in brain land. So we try to incentivize this other kind of scientific product, which is the kind of technological roadmap for research. And in areas that are a bit closer to kind of physics or chemistry or computation, I think you can sometimes make those roadmaps. How cheap can you really make this light source? Could you actually detect the DNA molecules, at a single molecule level for different sequencing technologies? Because I think the example you gave was great of if you ask biologists, they might invent a better Sanger sequencing instead of inventing next-gen sequencing and next-gen sequencing, which are based on other technologies. And ultimately that did get solved partly through very cross-disciplinary companies that got formed to go after these things, partly through physicists getting involved. And that was partly, I think, deliberate on the part of, again, I mentioned even with the Human Genome Project, there was some DOE involvement, and DOE kind of does actually sort of know how to do physics-based technology. But there was also the National Human Genome Research Institute, which sort of put out cross-disciplinary calls. So you can try to elicit this dark matter, right? But it's hard, and sometimes there's nobody whose job it is to actually go and figure out what's buildable, what's possible, and that's the road mapping. And so we think the road mapping is pretty important, and we like to try to find people who want to do that, try to support that in different ways, and try to comprehensively analyze the different ways you could fill those gaps, even if none of those look like a good project from a kind of practicality perspective for any one person at that moment. Yeah.
I think what's coming across, and you can sort of correct this or clarify this, is the right way to think about Convergent is almost like this scientific think tank that kind of ideates, maps, validates, helps fund these kind of focused research organizations that then go out and kind of do the work. Is that a good summary?
Yeah. So we're kind of a few things. Personally, I like to try to lean into that kind of think tank or almost like mission control element, like solving these coordination problems. Hey, we really need someone to take ownership of figuring out whether there's a physically possible way to do sequencing in this level. I really like that aspect. There's a bunch of other aspects that we are doing that make it possible. So one of these things is sort of this like being a matchmaker with funding. Because having the abstract idea is one thing, but you really also need passionate and capable scientific and organizational founders for these projects who are willing to go and build that and go devote their lives to going and doing that. Those people are just as important, more important really than these ideas about what's possible. You need to match them with funding, because the probability that person also knows how to get this thing funded is relatively low. So there's a matchmaking function. There's an operational function where we provide some amount of shared backend operations. So another thing that is an obstacle to this happening is, okay, great, I got a $10 million check. What kind of bank account should I put that in? You know, how do I actually store that money? How do I do my accounting? How do I make the budget for this? Okay, it turns out I've got my totally new team. How do I do human resources? You know, and startups do that. You know, you start with a really small startup, and then maybe your investors help you, and there's certain templates that people kind of use, outsource firms you can use. Eventually, maybe you have your own HR person. But with a focused research organization, you're kind of going pretty quickly to like, okay, now you have the money to go and map the connectome or something like that. You don't want to have to simultaneously have to learn everything about HR, right? And so Convergent also has back-end operations. We're also a parent organization. I didn't even mention, getting nonprofit status, and so we're a 501c3 nonprofit parent organization. The FROs right now are set up as subsidiaries of the parent. They roll up into the parent. That also allows us to provide these various services to them in a simple way. And we sit on the boards of the FROs. We help not only sort of help broker and match make for that initial fundraising, but make sure they're on track with their milestones, make sure that the project is governed in a way that's consistent with its mission, with what we are trying to get out of it, with what the funders are trying to get out of it. What if something goes wrong? Well, we're kind of there in this intermediary layer on the board, interacting with the different stakeholders. And so we also have what I would call that a governance and oversight function, and stakeholder kind of management or coalescence function. So we're a parent organization and we're an incubator. And then my personal favorite part is that we try to facilitate this kind of gap mapping or road mapping or bottleneck identification, or kind of figuring out what's possible. What are either these bottlenecks or these capabilities, and how would you form cross-disciplinary teams in the case where there's not enough market pull or not enough kind of funder pull or career pull for people to have like develop the exact mix of skills or teams to have the right combinations of elements. Otherwise, yeah.
I'm going to contrast this approach with other alternative structures that have been used to sort of solve or attempt to solve ambitious, audacious sort of challenges. One is a sort of incredibly well-funded for-profit companies that are closed, that have this sort of mission, and they're backed by billionaires. We kind of alluded to this earlier. Things like Calico, Altos, to a lesser extent, maybe Retro. And then, I mean, let's talk a little bit about this. Like, to me, it seems that these structures have been somewhat unsuccessful thus far at sort of being able to A, push the field forward, or B, reach sort of clinical stage assets that actually get into patients. It still might be sort of early days. But what do you think is special about this smaller 30-person startup structured org that has less funding and is sort of more focused? Why do they seem to be out-competing and out-producing and getting more attention, frankly, than some of these incredibly well-funded startups? Right?
Yeah, it's a really good set of questions. I mean, I think it really kind of remains to be seen. As I'm not sure that you can perfectly generalize on this. So there's a number of things I would call billionaire-backed startups, for lack of a better word, or moonshot startups or something like that. They're sort of beyond even what institutional VC firms, the far end of their kind of technological risk-taking, or they embody like this very concentrated research enterprise, very sort of scientist-driven. Some of them, I think, are looking real promising. So I think you could say early DeepMind was a little bit of that. That really went really well. Some of these New Limit, Retro. I mean, some of these I actually think, yeah, super promising. And I think there's also a move, I would say, where certain even Flagship or so on are doing some stuff that looks a little bit more like that. Self-driving lab companies, protein design companies, true platforms. They're not platform companies that just become asset companies very quickly, but really, truly like transformative platforms. I think it kind of remains to be seen in different cases, but I'm actually pretty optimistic about some of those. I think Neuralink actually has brain-computer interface that's like way better than what academia has been able to develop there in terms of the engineering and putting it in people and everything. So I'm a fan of billionaire-backed companies. I see them as on kind of a spectrum with the Fros. And we got into this question about open or closed, but in some ways you can have a billionaire-backed company that just publishes a lot. It depends on kind of what you want and what the expectation is. And if you really like solve aging or something, well, even if you published a bunch of stuff, that's probably going to be a really valuable company, right? So I'm a fan of moonshot companies too. At the same time, I think it is possible to have situations where you almost have too much money. I think this can be true in both a sort of public funding context and a private funding context. If you really put $1 billion into something, that may drive you towards conservatism, weirdly, right? It's like, oh my God, I put in $1 billion. This is on the company's balance sheet. And if I don't get a drug out, if I just release my research, I lost $1 billion. That feels, I think, very big to people. And so in some ways, projects that are too big in a corporate context can sometimes almost lend to conservatism. It can also lend to sort of politics. Who's controlling this big thing? There's, okay, well, I have a 20, 30 person, basic science effort. There's not as much risk aversion potentially. There's not as much need for that to produce returns. There's not as necessarily the level of oversight on it. There's not necessarily a lot of corporate politics of who's running that or how it's structured. And you can just focus on the science, maybe at that 20 or 30 person, very ambitious but nonprofit level. So I think a failure mode with big corporate efforts is that, yeah, they could become have a sort of corporate inertia or politics or risk aversion because of how the money is a large amount of money on a balance sheet. It can also happen in a public context where the scientific community kind of rebel against you if you've got the $1 billion project, and it becomes very political. And it's just actually just hard to spend that amount of money on one project, right? And so it maybe then fractures into almost too many little projects. And so there's something that I think is a sweet spot about that. And it's a sweet spot I would say that is actually by some of these billionaire-backed startups is being like appropriately targeted. Some of them look like for-profit Froze Plus or something like that. They don't look like huge institutes. I think both our nonprofit version of it and some of the billionaire-backed startups sort of converge on this like highly technical small team, kind of very concrete milestone or inflection point, very engineering heavy over like 3 or 4 or 5 years. Sufficient interaction and publishing with the rest of the community to get that feedback and kind of have a flywheel intellectually with the rest of the community. So yeah, so I think that there's sort of like, whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit, maybe the best of them, those 20-person engineering teams, 30-person engineering teams just look convergently excellent or something, and too big can sometimes be a little bit of unwieldy. Yeah.
So you did your PhD in physics at Harvard, and then you actually were an early researcher in the early days of DeepMind, I think now Google DeepMind. What was special about the environment that Demis and sort of John Jumper made that allowed this sort of similar architecture to become genuinely valuable and useful to humanity?
I mean, I wish I could. I think it's a huge achievement. I wish I could completely capture that. And I was a very minor, relatively junior researcher in the neuroscience team of DeepMind from like 2018 to 2020. So I saw a very small slice of it. I didn't really see the early period or a lot of the fundamental work. I had some friends who were on the AlphaFold team early days. I remember them like going from a more academic feel where they were like doing their own research and to be like, oh my God, I'm on this AlphaFold team, and it's like, it's really intense. We've got to produce, and seeing some of that shift in some of those people. I think that was pretty focused research organization like.
Almost internal to the organization.
Yeah. So this researcher, Mohammed Al-Quraishi, wrote a blog post, I think in 2021 or so, about the AlphaFold team right when it came out, and said, look, it's an 18 co-first author paper, and that they've set it up so that everyone is just rowing in the same direction, right, to build this thing. And is that really the essence of what made it work? In addition to a bunch of good intellectual ideas and deep learning and compute infrastructure and different things being in the right way, and a lot of clever object level things that they did and infrastructure things that they did. But like, was that why they made differentially so much progress compared to the rest of the protein folding community so fast? Was this Fro-like team structure and organization? I didn't see it directly, but I have a feeling that there's something true to that. But where I was in that ecosystem, it actually felt very academic in a very good way. There was a combination of top-down and bottom-up kind of planning in the company that allowed for a lot of smaller projects that were more researcher-driven. And there was a lot of just mentoring of more junior researchers by more senior researchers who were quite deeply involved in the technology and the science. And that was kind of that mentoring structure was kind of separate from the reporting structure that was kind of the formal reporting, and it was kind of separate from the company milestones. There was kind of this academic style mentoring that was happening. There was a lot of great papers being published. There was a lot of exchange among teams and kind of reading groups and working groups and all that. And so it was very impressive. It was just the best academic neuroscience lab with the best computers. It was pretty fantastic. And then if they wanted to, they're like, oh, we have line of sight on protein folding. Then they would organize the internal fro, if you will. So that was very very impressive. And I wish I knew, in some sense, like all of the ingredients that made that happen. I think it's an incredible feat to have made that happen. And lo and behold, it had a Nobel Prize in just a few years. So
Yeah.
Yep.
I do want to get into the art of funding and sort of the decline of federal government funding. But I think the one thing that our audience would probably be really interested in is, like, what are the, as we sort of were alluding to earlier and speaking about earlier, like what are the tools that are yet to be developed? What are the big, audacious, ambitious projects that could be structured as FROs and that sort of Convergent is interested in and is sort of maybe either recruiting leaders for or is just thinking about and brainstorming right now? It could be across sort of everything from therapeutics to sort of more of the sociological things you mentioned. We've already talked about the mathematical proof code. We've talked about connectome mapping. What else is there?
Yeah. There's different ways to answer that. I could answer that with, say, well, we have 200 missing capabilities or sort of under-resourced, somewhat underdeveloped, promising capabilities in the gap map. So that's a very broad answer. I mean, I could answer it in a much more narrow way of some of the things we think are particularly important to just prioritize. Like if we have finite ability to like go and get philanthropic or government resources, like what do we actually think is important to prioritize and find these very concrete technological gaps. Some of the areas where we're thinking about that is even, social sciences. So tools for sort of democratic discourse and deliberation, tracking and fighting sort of misinformation, other things in social sciences. I think we sort of need like a real world SimCity, right? A kind of agent-based modeling of the economy is probably there's some really like fro-shaped problem elements in that of sort of there's this researcher in Oxford now named Doan Farmer who sort of wrote this book about complexity economics, he calls it, which is sort of bottom-up agent-based modeling in economics, which is it's like very far from the way economics mostly works. Mostly economics works by like either very data-driven, kind of just running statistics and predicting, or making a lot of assumptions about, equilibrium and rational actors and stuff like that in order to kind of simplify it. And it's very hard to like make a bottom-up model of the economy where, all the different firms are modeled as individual like agents or something like that. There's so many of them, we don't have the right data. But can you basically make like a real world SimCity? That kind of field. And there's some reasons why people certainly could do versions of that as for-profit companies too. But so there are things in social sciences. We're very interested in like biosecurity, defensive biosecurity type of technologies. There's a lot of market failures there.
Touch on that a little bit.
Yeah. There is some stuff starting to get going there, but it's been surprisingly difficult. I think the government is starting to act on it a little bit, and some nonprofits are starting to act on it, but it's been surprisingly difficult to get this vision of like ubiquitous sequencing or ubiquitous detection, right? Nucleic Acid Observatory is kind of a somewhat fro-like project that's doing sort of wastewater sequencing, right, to do very early detection. Can you extend that from sequencing to detecting, volatile compounds, breath? So early detection, some of these questions about physical methods of blocking transmission. There's still a lot we don't know about using far ultraviolet C light to basically zap tiny pathogens in the air without harming, human skin and eye cells. So from just a kind of raw like prioritization, like stuff we want to work on, like that kind of defensive biosecurity bucket is something that we're really interested in. In terms of some other things we have just immediately on the horizon, so we have one person named Anand that we're incubating as a fellow. He wants to make a generalization of the continuous glucose monitor. So measuring in the interstitial fluid continuously on a human, some metabolite or hormone concentration. You can do that with continuous glucose monitors. He wants to use protein engineering to make a kind of continuous everything monitor. And there are some companies that are like trying to extend continuous glucose monitoring to like certain key applications that exist, like cortisol is one that one wants for sort of general mental health. Be great for the military, all sorts of different kinds of applications to like extend from glucose to like glucose plus cortisol plus a few other things. But what's like the really general platform? And what is the research tool, the enabling research tool of being able to measure many metabolites at once as they dynamically fluctuate in the human body? So that project is called Melody, and we're incubating Anand and basically trying to get that thing funded. We're also we have an incubation program, residency, we call it, in the UK, that we're doing in partnership with ARIA, the Advanced Research and Invention Agency in the UK. And we've selected down basically from kind of 100 or so applications for FROs from the UK, down to 5 residents in that program. And they have proposals that they're working on related from everything from basically more neuroscience. So there's a team that wants to do a dynamic connectome. So the E11 Bio is doing a static connectome. You've chemically fixed the brain in place. The mouse is dead, and you map the wiring. They want to do a dynamic connectome. So stimulate one neuron, see which other ones respond, and then infer connections from that, and then see how that changes over time. So maybe I give the animal a drug. How do those connections change over time? There's another team in there that's working on genetically engineering algae for coral reef restoration. And can you make the coral more thermal tolerant? So that's kind of an ecological engineering application. There are a couple teams in there that are working on platforms for either better measurement or better sharing and kind of compression and transmission of either environmental data, lots of existing environmental kind of climate geospatial data. How do you make the platform for people to be able to actually analyze that when it's sort of stored in many different places? How do you measure ecological variables in a more compact way and have a kind of universal sensor for ecology? So there's basically a bunch of ideas percolating. Yeah. So we one lens is like, what do we think is most urgent, like maybe biosecurity. Another lens is what aligns with opportunity spaces that partners like ARIA have identified and that are just really solid teams and fro-shaped problems. Or these, we still love these kind of biological platforms of like, how do you make really comprehensive biological measurement? As you pointed out, right, there's lots of like incredible platform kind of biotech companies, but there's still this tendency for them to go in a more like single asset or like develop a drug direction versus like with this Melody continuous monitoring of arbitrary combinations of hormones and metabolites. That's like, it's almost like a genome project or atlas that you ultimately need to make of like, how do chemicals change in your body in different states? And what's the supporting technology for that? So, yeah.
This reminds me of something that I was going to ask earlier around other grant and funding organizations. I mean, we obviously ARPA-H has a project called REACT that is kind of similarly structured to this, except obviously the collaboration looks very different. You have these hand-selected labs that work on a single aspect, right? Like one is just working on the synthetic cells themselves and the gene circuit design, and one's just on the light emitting diode and sort of how that interfaces with the Bluetooth device. Yeah. I mean, this could be a whole other podcast episode on like what funding structures work.
You should do some ARPA program manager podcast episodes. Yeah,
I think that's definitely in the horizon.
Yeah.
But the thing that I think you are particularly good at, that I think people want to hear about, is how to drum up excitement and raise from billionaires and raise funding in an age where the federal government and governments generally are somewhat retreating from the large allocations that they previously made to research and development. Obviously, like ARIA, for example, is a step in the opposite direction. It's a great advancement, but it is also maybe like too little, too late. In what ways can you describe how funding works when it's these big philanthropic donors and sort of convincing them to back these audacious projects that don't have any financial return?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I certainly hope that government doesn't really retreat. And I think steps like ARIA, I hope that the government innovates and changes certain things, but ultimately really does not retreat at all. And that what we're doing ends up getting sort of reified into more like government processes as well. But yeah, so right now, we really bootstrapped it with philanthropy. We have 34, I think now, different philanthropic donors into Convergent, and there's others in kind of different parts of the ecosystem. Yeah, what to say about it? I mean, we're something that philanthropy can do that is special is that it can sort of, in principle, it can act quite fast, right? And it can act quite fast on a new thing. In principle, you have just extremely empowered individuals. The money is literally in their bank account. In some cases, it's literally in their bank account. And then they've actually moved it to a donor advised fund or to a foundation that actually has some requirement for them to actually disperse it. So they're actually incentivized. The foundation has to give out 5% a year or whatever that may be. I forgot the exact numbers, but then where that goes within some broad remit of sort of charitable uses, there's incredible speed and agency with which philanthropists can go. And so they've been able to take a risk on something where building the different layers of government processes that you would have needed to get Froze going is actually quite complicated. So with ARIA, we have this incubator program with them, but they first needed to create ARIA, which was a new kind of civilian ARPA-like agency, ARPA-style agency. And then within that agency, they had to create a mechanism with Froze and then partner with Convergent as a sort of delivery partner, and then set up the residency program, and then figuring out how to do all the grant agreements and everything. A philanthropist in principle can essentially just write a check. And so that speed is really powerful, and that has been like super enabling for us. It's also challenging ecosystem to navigate. It's very opaque. Right, so these big government funders. I mean, the downside of it is this is very standardized, kind of bureaucratic process, very centralized. That's sort of led to almost this like over standardization, hyper competition, and other types of problems that we have in the federal systems. But at least you know where to submit the grant to. Many foundations and what to submit it for. In some sense, they put up solicitations. Many foundations, some of them don't really communicate what the relevant funder is actually really interested in, what their real decision function is, when are they going to give out money, how much, to whom, who else they will and won't kind of co-invest with, what causes them to feel trust in a project. They don't necessarily communicate those things. In some cases, they don't actually know what they want because just someone who made a lot of money, let's say in finance or some other field, and they actually don't have a very specific opinion about what to do in neuroscience, right? So they need some intermediary to help them decide whether neuroscience even makes sense as an area to go into, let's say, or whether non-model organisms or climate modeling or these other areas. So sometimes foundations get very locked up in like just prioritizing the causes, right? Are we going to work in carbon removal? Are we going to work in solar radiation management? Are we going to work on data for climate? Even if you have a wealthy individual who says, I want to make an impact on climate. There are different theories of change, and they can spend years just deciding whether or not to do something on carbon removal versus on some climate modeling versus on something else. Sometimes they have a very specific interest. I want to make an impact on sustainability or of food system, or I want to make an impact on cancer. And then translating that to, okay, over here we have a focused research organization to get genetic tractability in a wider range of non-model microorganisms. Well, I think that could have a huge impact on the food system if we can genetically engineer better fungi. But making that translation for the food donor or the cancer donor to these platform technology projects, single-cell proteomics or non-model organisms, that translation is very hard. And they may not have experts on staff, and they may not know where to find those experts. And we may not even know that they're interested in the food system. And so it's a very opaque and fragmented ecosystem broadly as a system. Some of our partners, organization called Renaissance Philanthropy, that kind of spun up a few years after we did. Tom Khalil is our board chair, and he runs Renaissance Philanthropy. They're trying to act as a kind of competent matchmaker, market maker in many ways, to make this system more efficient, be able to deploy money faster with more confidence, and for scientists to be able to surface their ideas and identify who would fund that more efficiently. So these intermediary market makers, someone has to pay for their existence also. And it requires very cross-disciplinary expertise and relationships to make that work. So we do some matchmaking. Renfil does some matchmaking. And in contrast, if you are going after a VC-funded project, there is something of a playbook, and it's certainly evolved over time. I think there didn't always used to be a playbook. In the 70s, there probably wasn't much of a playbook. But now there's Y Combinator safe agreements, standard agreements, for convertible note financing, and there's understanding. There's lots of VCs may work on a similar area and develop a kind of theses about when they work together and what the right companies are. And also there's just enough incentive, right? There's the financial incentive. And there's also almost like a number, like, is your thing possibly a multi-billion-dollar company on a certain time scale? Look at probabilities as more numerical to filter. So if you're a company, you can basically, I'm going to go raise a round, and maybe you weren't ready to raise a round last month. This month you're ready to raise a round. Yeah, the market conditions might be bad, various things might be bad, but generally speaking, you can go raise a round like at any time, right? Like in June, you decide I want to raise a round. A few months later, maybe you've actually raised that round. If I say I want to go raise a philanthropic round, from which philanthropist, with which interests, based on which connections, based on, right? And so it's quite hard to navigate. And so I think that matchmakers play an important role. Templatized ideas or mechanisms like the Focused Research Organization, just saying, okay, this is something that has been done before. This is roughly the characteristics it has. This is how it's governed. This is the kind of risk-reward trade-off associated with the FRO. This is how they're selected. Having a more standardized process there makes it more possible for people to press go on their interests in a given scientific topic that might be possible. Yeah, and I think obviously philanthropists also still play a big role in filling gaps, where there's the federal funding of universities. Philanthropic funding into the regular academic system is also still super important, and that has similar problems. How do you choose between Harvard and Stanford if you're a philanthropist in terms of where do you donate to? Often it's like vibes or personal history rather than this is how you're going to accomplish the scientific goal.
So you really needed like an information aggregator organization that understands who all the philanthropists are, how to contact them, what they're interested in, what they're thinking about. You need a mediator that can decide which projects are a good fit for particular philanthropists. And then also you need a, maybe not like a playbook, but sort of like a platform enabler that sort of, as you mentioned, sort of templatizes the creation of organizations and engages in the mediation and sort of the establishment of trust between the philanthropists and the sort of scientist-heavy
One
visionaries.
thing that I think is it's both good and a little bit distorting about the focused research organizations is they are concrete and they're sort of medium to large size single efforts. The more checks I think someone has to write, the more just burden. You could do it in a more kind of random way, but if you're going to do it in a very precise way, the more different checks you have to write, and the more indirect or complex the cause and effect chain of writing those checks to what you actually care about, the harder it gets, right? You're just going to need more staff to be able to make good decisions about 100 grants than you are going to make good decisions about 2 grants, I think. And so what we're creating is a medium-sized vehicle that has extremely concrete goal and deliverable. That with this much money and this much time, we will put out this data set, which will have this catalytic impact on the field broadly. That means you don't have to choose between this hypothesis about Alzheimer's or that, between this lab or that lab, between 3 checks to these groups or 5 checks to those 5 other groups. We just built this Hubble Space Telescope and everyone will lift, right? And that simplifies, I think, the decision function and makes it a little bit more tractable. And I think that's being able to have things that are able to absorb these medium-sized checks in a systematic way is actually valuable in the ecosystem because there's so much decision paralysis and so much effort that goes into the decision making. That's really hard to kind of solve this resource allocation problem. And if we can have sort of medium-sized chunks to which one can allocate resources. LPs do this in some ways by like funding a VC fund also. Convergent is also an example of this, right? Of kind of like, we're a little bit like a VC firm that has LPs a little bit. Versus the LPs having to individually decide which companies to invest in. Yeah.
I see. Okay. So you, Adam, are a lubricator of the scientific, economic, philanthropic machine.
We are trying, and it's a very complex machine that is not easy to lubricate, but we're trying to create these very clearly valuable and very clear what you get out of them in what time scale, kind of medium-sized vehicles. And yeah.
Last question for you. What is a book that you'd recommend to our audience that you think would either inspire them or teach them something about what you do?
A book that I read recently that I really enjoyed on the neuroscience side was called A Brief History of Intelligence. That really contextualizes sort of what's going on in AI in light of the evolution of the brain. So for all the things we're doing in neuroscience, I think that's actually really good to kind of like get a framework. Like people often get exposed to these topics in like a biology class in high school that they hated or something, where they tried to remember the difference between the cerebellum and the hippocampus, and it doesn't really all make sense. Why are we going to all this effort for all this neuroscience? And A Brief History of Intelligence kind of like helps contextualize all that in terms of what AI is happening. So I really, on the science side, I really like that one. On the institutional side, I've been trying to get myself to read more business and kind of startup books. For scientists thinking about kind of what is it like to run a fro as opposed to an academic lab or do research. I enjoyed this book, very short book called The Great CEO Within, which is written by this executive coach, Matt Mokary, which is kind of a distillation of like 5 or 6 other books. There's kind of some cadre of like business books, high output management, and a bunch of other business books, 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. My co-founder has read like all the business books. And I'm like, I need like the Cliff Notes version. So I think there are probably some books sort of to be written, sort of like project management for scientists or something that hasn't quite been written. Maybe some of the executive coaches of the people doing Froze and founder-led sort of deep tech companies need to sort of write the high output management, but for science organizations or something like that. Yeah, okay. I've struggled to kind of fully engage on some of the more historical examples. There's other books about skunkworks and about Bell Labs and about Vannevar Bush and everything, and this is all really interesting stuff, but I'm somehow like just much more in the here and now. But some of my colleagues spend a lot of time reading Vannevar Bush's memoirs and stuff like that.
I think there is something to be said about taking lessons from the past, taking lessons from company building and being a great CEO and applying them to fostering environments of innovation, whether they are FROs or whether they are companies or startups or institutions, academic institutions. Adam, it's been a pleasure having you on. I've learned a lot, and thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, really appreciate being on here. Really appreciate all the great questions. So
awesome.